If you want to be able to make dynamic edits to your photos based on color ranges and luminance ranges, then the Lightroom Range Mask tool is the tool for you. I'm going to teach you all about it in this video. Okay, so the first thing to know about the Range Mask tool is that it works in concert with either the graduated filter, the radial filter, or the adjustment brush. Now, we love these tools because they let you go from making global edits to making local edits on a smaller area of the image. Now, the Range Mask tool is going to let you take that a step farther and be even more specific about where you're making edits. So that's what makes this a really awesome tool. So let's dive right into a practical example just so we can really understand how this tool is working. Okay, so here I am in the develop module and I have a image of a color wheel on screen, and this is just going to be helpful in really seeing how this tool works. So remember, this tool works in concert with the graduated filter, the radial filter, and the adjustment brush. So for now I will just grab this graduated filter and I'm just going to drag out on this side of the screen, and then I'll even slide it over here. So what I have, and see that green is just because I have my overlay turned on. If you tap the O key on your keyboard, you can turn that mask overlay on and off to show you exactly what area you have selected. But also if I make an adjustment here, so you see if I drag my exposure up, I am indeed affecting basically this entire area on screen. So let me just double click that to bring the exposure down. But so I do have a selection drawn around everything on my screen. Now, once I have an adjustment brush or a graduated filter or a radial filter started, then at the bottom I now have this Range Mask tool. By default, it will start in the off position. But if you do the drop down here, your choices then become color or luminance. So within the selection you've created on screen, you can then become more specific and define a color range or a luminance range that you want to select, and everything else is going to be masked and is not going to be affected. So you are defining the area that you want to be affected by your edits. So for starters, let's talk about color range. So I'm going to go ahead and select color here. And you can see once I've selected color from the Range Mask drop down, I now have this color eyedropper here, and it even says right here, use the color range selector to sample colors within the mask area. Click plus drag for greater accuracy, shift plus click to add multiple samples. So let's work through an example and it's going to become pretty obvious. So you first have to grab your tool, and if you're trying to isolate the greens, I'm going to come over here on my color range. I'm going to select these greens, and again what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to come back and I'm going to drag this exposure up just so we can see what's happening there. So you can see when I've selected the greens now, you can see how those greens, the exposure is being affected in those areas. If I were to click here, you see how now my color range, I'm affecting some of those reds and stuff. If I come down to my blues, I can click. And so I am defining different color ranges that I want affected. Now, once you make a selection, you then have this amount slider, which lets you basically define how liberal of a range you want to select. So if you drag this amount up higher and higher, it is going to pull in more and more colors that are close to that range. It's going to broaden out that spectrum of colors. By the same token, if you drag this amount slider down, then you're getting more and more specific, and you're really telling it that I want this very specific range of colors close to the color that you have clicked with the color selector there. And the other thing you can do is you can define more than one color range. So you can see right now I've clicked it up here in this red area here. If I hold down my shift, I can then click and bring in other color ranges. And then by shift clicking again and again, I am defining more ranges that I want brought in to those color spectrums. And again, the amount slider still applies. And so with multiple colors selected now, I can go ahead and click amount, and it's going to slide out and be more liberal and select more colors close to those ranges. So looking at this color wheel example, you can see it really does give you a great level of control in terms of defining specific colors that you want to affect, specific colors that you don't want to affect, and then with this amount slider, that's when you can go in and you can get even more specific. Okay, so that's using option 1, color, for the range mask. The other option is luminance, but I think for luminance and color, we're going to go ahead and jump in now into some farther real-world examples. Okay, we have this picture of these peppers on screen now. Now let's imagine the scenario where we want to make edits to just affect these yellow peppers. Well, this is a great case for using the color range on the range mask tool. So what I'm going to do is come in under my adjustment brush, because remember, you have to first use one of your adjustment tools, which would either be the radial filter, the graduated filter, or the adjustment brush, and then you can make a selection, and then within that selection you can make it even more specific with the range mask tool. So if I wanted to, for example, I could take my adjustment brush and I'm going to hit the O for overlay so I can see as I paint on screen. So if I just paint the bottom half of this image, then any adjustments I make with the range mask tool are just going to affect this bottom area. So it gives you two different degrees of control. First, what you're doing with your adjustment brush or whatever local adjustment tool you're using, and then farther within that when you use the range mask tool. But I'm going to go ahead and select everything here for this example. So everything on screen is in play. Now, the O for overlay lets you see that overlay mask, and I think Shift O, let's try Shift O. Yes, Shift O lets you cycle through different overlay colors. So that's one way just to get a visual representation of that mask. Again, hit O on your keyboard and it'll turn that on and off. But you also can come in here and make a change, and then you will see that on screen. So sometimes it's helpful to go to the extreme when you're sort of honing in that selection, just so you can really see what areas are being affected and what areas are not being affected. So this image is obviously overexposed now, but it is giving me a good visual representation of what is being affected. And so what I'm going to do now is come in under my range mask tool and click color. And then if I grab my eyedropper tool, I'm going to start to click on the yellow peppers and try to find a way to bring this mask in this affected area just down to those yellow peppers. So if I click on this pepper here, you can see that instantly the area that's being affected has really started to pull in on these peppers here. Now, you can control the sort of liberal, how flexible you are with that color range, how large of a range that is with this amount slider down here. So if I drag it down, and then I drag it up, you can see at the highest range, I'm starting to pick up the orange pepper, I'm starting to pick up some other things. So you can really drag that amount up or down to decide how liberal you want to be with that color range. Now the other way is to start to bring in some other colors. So I'm going to tap the O key on my keyboard just so we can see that overlay. And now if I use this color sampler tool and I use the Shift key, now I'm adding to the existing color range. So if I start to click other places on this yellow pepper, then I'm bringing in those other colors and I'm making that range even wider within that color range there. So I could also decide I want to add in other colors altogether. So I could keep the yellow pepper selected and I could shift click on my red pepper and add in a red color range. I could shift click on my orange pepper and add another color range. So remember, if you shift click, you're bringing in another color range. If you just click on something individually, then you're resetting and you're starting with a new color range. So if I have yellow selected and then I click on red, I am only adding that red and starting over. I'm ditching the yellow. But if you use that shift, then you will see that plus icon. You see the plus icon that shows up on my cursor. And so when you shift click, you're adding in more color ranges. Now remember, with the adjustment brush, you can add as many adjustment points as you want to. So it would really only make sense to choose multiple color ranges if you knew you were going to then want to do the same edits on those ranges. But let's say I thought maybe the red peppers would need more shadow brightening or exposures. I could use two different adjustment brushes, and then I could use a color range mask on one of them to affect the red colors, and then I could do another adjustment brush and use that color range mask to affect the yellow colors. So just remember, you always have these different options and variability in different ways you can attack problems in Lightroom. So once you learn these tools, you really start to think about what is the best and most efficient way for me to attack this problem. Okay, so we've talked about the color range option for the range mask tool. Now let's look at a different photo and let's talk about the luminance option. Okay, so I have this photo open here. I'm going to come in here and do the same thing as I did before. Actually, this time I think I'll just take a graduated filter. I'm going to once again, I'm just going to actually put it so it goes off screen here, because again, I just want to select everything for the purpose of the example so we can really see how this range mask part of it works. But if I hit the O for overlay, you'll see I have everything selected there on screen. So now what I want to do is come in under range mask and choose luminance. Now you'll notice that this works a little different. Instead of seeing that eyedropper tool that we saw before, which allowed you to select colors, we now have these range sliders and we have this smoothness slider. Okay, so to understand how this works, you basically have to understand that luminance basically equals the brightness values in your photo. So when you think of this range here, what I want you to think of is all the way to the left of this range, those are your blacks and the darker areas of your photo. And then as you move to the right, things get brighter. You have your midtones of your image. And then when you get all the way to the right, those are the white areas. Those are the highlight areas of your image. So this range is basically the range of brightness throughout any given photo. And then the smoothness, if you think of feathering, like you have feathering in Photoshop and in Lightroom, where you can control how soft the edges are, how quick the fall off is, that's where this smoothness slider comes into play. So let's go ahead and work through an example here. So since we have a mask selecting the whole thing, and now I'm being more specific by defining a luminance range, what I first want to do is come up here and just make some change. So we're going to see that as I start to pull these sliders here. So I've dialed up the exposure, and now if I pull this range here, you got to think you're controlling what is being affected. So if I start to take the blacks out of that range, you can see those exposure adjustments I made are now only being applied to the brighter parts of the image. So if I drop that back down and I start to pull on this top handle, then you can see that now I am taking those brighter areas of the image and they are no longer getting that exposure shift, and now it's just happening in the darker areas of my image. So if I tap the O key there to see the overlay, you can see how as I drag this down, this is really getting sucked in to the darker areas of the image. And then if you go to smoothness here, you'll notice if I drag that down, it really drags it in even farther and you have a quicker fall off. If I drag this smoothness out to the right, you'll notice that those edges start to feather out more. So again, we can look at the opposite. If I come this way, then suddenly I'm taking it to where the black areas are no longer being affected as much. And again, if I pull this down here, I'm really taking those black areas out. And now if you tap the O on and off, you can see that only really the highlights in the image are now being affected by that exposure adjustment. So, luminance mask really lets you go in there and pick different brightness values. And if you want to deal with just the highlights of your image or just the shadow areas of your image, then you can come in and you can make those specific adjustments and edits to just those areas. And remember, the smoothness slider is basically going to let you control that feather. Do you want it to be a little bit harsher of an edge, a little bit quicker fall off, or do you really want it to feather out into other areas as a more slow, gradual change? Just as a quick update, right around the time I was recording this video in October of 2018, Lightroom did come out with an update, and as part of that update, there is now a third option under the Range Mask tool, and that option is called Depth. Now you'll see that it's grayed out here. This is not going to work on all photos. A lot of your current photos it may not work on. It is only available for certain photos taken with newer iPhone cameras that have dual lenses, and those cameras are able to capture depth information related to your photo. And if you have that depth information, then suddenly you're going to have a third option here, which is going to allow you to select ranges based on whether that option is in the foreground or in the background. And I'm not going to cover that in this video, but what I'll do is I'll provide a link below in the description. So after you're watching this video, if you want to go check it out, you can go check it out. All right. Hopefully you can see how easy the Range Mask tool is to use. Hopefully you can see the efficiency and the power it gives you. You can be even more precise with selections, and a lot of times you can make those selections now a lot faster. Imagine if you wanted to use the adjustment brush and go in and select all the highlights of your image. You might be drawing for a long time. If you use something like the Luminance Range Mask, you can go in there and get that a lot quicker. Same for selecting color ranges. So take everything you've learned here in this video, put it to good use. I think you're really going to love the range mask tool in Lightroom. This is Greg from Purpose Blogger. Thanks for watching. I hope you hit the subscribe button below, and I'll see you soon.